Welcome back, horror community. In a quiet North Korean town lost between the lake and the mountains, the fog never comes alone. It carries with it the shadows of the dead, those who return not for revenge, but to tell you the truth about betrayal, about a son who left his father to die, about an old man who cast his son out of his home. The main character, an architect named Cheol, thought he had already survived everything: love, loss, loneliness. Until one night he saw his wife sitting on a bench by the lake. His wife, who had been dead for 3 years. 3 years she'd been lying under the water, while he drank and pretended to forget. But the fog in this town does not forgive forgetfulness. Turn off the lights. We're starting a new story. Cheol sat in his favorite bar at his usual corner table, slowly turning an almost empty glass in his hand. He poured himself more whiskey from the bottle on the table. His movements were precise and practiced, like someone long married to this ritual. The owner, Minho, was polishing glasses behind the counter, occasionally throwing him a knowing glance. He was one of those rare people who knew how to stay silent, and Cheol valued that more than any sympathy. "Call it a night, architect," Minho said quietly without looking up. "Time to go home before you start seeing dead folks by the lake again." There were no dead folks, Cheol muttered, taking a sip of whiskey. "I just had a little too much." Stepping outside, he zipped up his jacket and walked quickly down the empty road leading to his house. On his right, the lake loomed dark and still. And then he saw her. On the same bench where he and Soyeon used to sit, there was a woman, transparent, as if woven from fog and moonlight itself. She was wearing that same blue dress, and she was looking straight at him. Slowly, like in a dream, he took a step forward. The figure didn't vanish. It only became clearer. He could see the familiar shape of her eyes, the soft waves of her hair falling over her shoulders. "Soyeon?" His voice came out as a rough whisper. The figure only tilted her head slightly. No sound, no movement. She just looked at him with an expression he couldn't decipher. Sadness, reproach, or maybe eternal pity. And then she simply dissolved. Not walked away, not drifted off. She dissolved into the air as if she'd never been there. Nothing was left on the bench except the damp gleam of the wood. Cheol stood there for several more minutes, then suddenly turned and almost ran home, not looking back, feeling a piercing, invisible gaze on his back. He desperately wanted to believe it was just a hallucination, because the alternative was far worse. The next morning, with a hangover, fear was replaced by something else. A strange feeling, as if he were waiting for something. And the town seemed to share his mood. On his way to the only grocery store, Cheol noticed how his usually friendly neighbors now avoided eye contact, their faces tense and closed off, as if they'd all suddenly remembered some old, unpleasant secret. That evening, he came back to his favorite bar. "What's going on today?" Cheol asked, sitting down in his usual spot. "Everyone's walking around like it's a funeral. Or am I seeing things again?" "Remember old man Pak, the one who lives across the street," said Minho. "Well, he threw his son out of the house," Minho said quietly. "Was yelling in the street, told him never to come back." "They fight over money," Cheol guessed, but Minho shook his head. "Not money. Last night, old man Pak was visited by the shadow of his dead wife. She whispered in his ear that their youngest son wasn't his. Said she cheated on him once, and he'd been raising another man's kid for 20 years. The old man snapped and kicked him out. Cheol froze with the glass halfway to his lips. "That's insane. Just gossip," he rasped. "Gossip, huh?" Minho leaned over the counter, lowering his voice. "And what about Teacher Kai-hoon, our wise old sage? His father's shadow came to him today, whispered that he'd sent his own brother to a labor camp years ago just to take his house. They're dragging everything out into the open, Cheol. Everything people tried to bury, the truth, and it looks like it's only beginning." Cheol set his glass down, remembering the figure on the bench last night. Could it have been something more than a drunken vision? He reached for the inner pocket of his jacket where he always kept that old photograph, as if trying to anchor himself in a world suddenly slipping away. But instead of comfort, a sharp, stabbing thought hit him. What if she knows? What if she knows what I did back then? For 3 days, Cheol didn't drink. He tried to work on his blueprints, but the lines kept blurring before his eyes, forming the familiar outline of a woman in a blue dress. "Pull yourself together," he growled at himself. "You're a grown man, not a scared kid." But logic shattered against a simple fact. The town was losing its mind. From his window, he saw neighbors sneaking from house to house, glancing around fearfully. The air was thick with unspoken accusations and dread, and that dread was contagious. On the 4th day, he couldn't take it anymore. He had to know if he was losing his mind alone, or if everyone else was too. Late at night, when the town had gone completely silent, he slipped into his study. In the bottom drawer, beneath stacks of blueprints, lay an old cardboard box. His personal archive, his past. With trembling hands, he pulled it out and set it on the table. Dust stirred in the beam of his desk lamp. Inside were old photographs, a few letters, and that same porcelain cup, glued together from shards, the last gift from Soyeon. He ran his finger along the rough seam, feeling a lump rise in his throat. That's all that's left. Just pieces. Then the air in the room turned freezing, not just cold, bone deep, as if a wind from the permafrost had seeped through the cracks. Cheol slowly lifted his head. She was standing in the doorway, not blurry like before, but almost alive. Her face was pale, and her eyes looked at him with bottomless sorrow. "Soyeon," he whispered, his voice breaking. She didn't move. But her voice, quiet and clear, rang directly in his mind, burning from within. "Why did you lie to me that last time, Cheol? You promised to be honest." He flinched, knocking over the box. "What last time? What are you talking about?" he wanted to shout, but only managed to move his lips silently. He remembered that night. He'd been drunk, she had asked him something important, and he, trying to brush her off, muttered some tired excuse about work and fell asleep. That was their last night together. At that very moment, the glued porcelain cup on the table trembled for no reason. It rocked, as if nudged by an invisible hand, then fell to the floor and shattered into pieces with a dry, ringing crack. Cheol stared at the fragments, and instead of panic, he felt a hollow realization. The past he'd tried so hard to glue back together could no longer hold. It was broken, and something was starting to seep out through the cracks. A week passed. Cheol barely left the house, living in a kind of stupor, interrupted only by chilling visits. Soyeon's shadow now appeared regularly, sometimes just standing in a corner, silent and relentless, sometimes whispering fragments of their old conversations, tearing open half-healed wounds. He stopped drinking. Alcohol didn't numb it anymore. It only made her image sharper, more unbearable. One morning, looking out the window, He froze, his hand tightening on the frame. 2 people were walking down the street, a man and a woman, and he recognized them instantly, as if he'd seen them just yesterday. Kang Seok Cheol, once a powerful official from Pyongyang, and Yoon Hee. That Yoon Hee. They were looking around at the houses as if picking out a new place to live. "No," Cheol whispered, stepping back from the window into the shadows of the room. "Not this. Not here." That same evening, Soyeon's shadow appeared again. She stood before him, and her whisper wasn't sorrowful this time. It was heavy with bitter clarity. "Do you remember the first time you cheated on me? It was at the hotel, room 307. You told me you had a late meeting." Cheol felt the floor drop from under him. Those details, no one could have known them. No one but him and Yoon Hee. How do you know that?" he stammered, but the shadow only looked at him, her eyes filled with all the knowledge in the world. The next day, when he went out to buy bread, he came face to face with Soyeon's mother, Park Yeon-hee. She stood at the entrance of the store, her usually calm face twisted with such hatred that he instinctively stepped back. "Murderer," she hissed so quietly only he could hear. "Your lies killed her. You broke her. She knew about your whore. She knew everything. And that last night, you lied to her again. You took away her last hope." She spat at his feet and walked off, leaving him standing in the middle of the street under the heavy, judgmental stares of his neighbors. It was as if they'd all heard her words, as if they all already knew. Night fell. The little town, already drowning in silent suspicion, finally choked on its own fear. Cheol couldn't stay inside any longer. Almost without realizing it, he walked toward the lake, the same place where it had all begun. He stood at the edge of the water, staring toward the spot where Soyeon had drowned, trying to understand what he felt. Guilt? Yes. Fear? Absolutely. But through it all, something else broke through. A desperate, feverish hope that maybe, right now, he'd finally understand. "I'm here," he said hoarsely into the night. "I came. Show me the truth I've been hiding all this time." The air thickened, and she stepped out of the darkness. Not appeared, but stepped out as if she'd been there all along. Her figure was almost black against the black water, faintly shimmering. Her voice, soundless yet all-penetrating, lashed through his mind like a whip, and before his eyes, scenes began to unfold. That evening, he'd come home drunk. Soyeon met him at the door. One more word, and the tears would have spilled from her eyes. "Cheol, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. "Not now, I'm tired," he muttered, trying to pass her. "It's important. I know about you two. I know about Yoon Hee." He froze, the drunken haze clearing for a second, replaced by icy dread. But instead of remorse, instead of truth, what burst from him was the coward's ancient defense. "What are you talking about? What Yoon Hee? You're imagining things. I was with my colleagues in a meeting." He saw the last spark of hope die in her eyes. Saw something inside her break completely. She didn't say another word, just turned and walked to the bedroom. And in the morning, they found her in the lake. The vision vanished. Cheol stood there, breathing hard, staring at the shadow that now knew everything. "You didn't kill me, Cheol. You destroyed everything we had. You left me alone when I still tried to believe you, and then you lied. I couldn't live with that lie anymore." He collapsed to his knees, and for the first time in years, a sound somewhere between a moan and a sob tore from his throat. It hadn't been an accident, nor suicide. It was negligent murder of the soul, and he had been the executioner. He lifted his head, his eyes filled with despair. "What do I do?" he whispered to the shadow that was his dead conscience. "What do I do now?" Cheol couldn't think of anything except one thing. He needed to talk to someone, to pour out the poisonous truth eating him alive. The only place he could go was Minho's bar. The bar was empty. Without a word, Minho set 2 shot glasses on the counter and poured whiskey into them. "I need to tell you something," Cheol said. "Otherwise, I'll either explode or lose my mind." He spoke about his wife, about how selfish and deceitful he'd been. He told him about Yun-hee, about the affairs, about the lies that had become second nature. He described that final night in such detail it was as if he were reliving it, and his own voice sounded alien and disgusting to him. "And Soyun looked at me with tears in her eyes," he said. "And I told her she was making it up. The last thing I ever said to her was another lie. And in the morning, they found her in the lake." Minho exhaled slowly. He didn't look at Cheol with hatred. In his eyes was only a weary, boundless sadness. "I knew," he said quietly. Cheol looked up at him in disbelief. "You knew what?" "That you had a heavy past, that you were hiding something, but this—" Minho shook his head. "Why, Cheol? Why are you telling me all this now?" "Because she's here," Cheol suddenly shouted, the chair clattering to the floor. "She follows me everywhere, whispering it in my ear, every night, every minute. She's dragging it all out, and I can't take it anymore." Cheol fell silent, trembling all over, and in the heavy stillness his desperate cry hung in the air like a sentence. He had exhaled his truth, but instead of relief he felt only a new, freezing emptiness. The confession hadn't brought forgiveness. It had only stripped the wound bare, revealing how deep and incurable it truly was. "You hear that?" Minho asked quietly. It sounded like a door creaked open in the storage room. Maybe just the wind. "I'll go check." He stepped into the back room, leaving Cheol alone in the empty bar. A whisper came from inside. At first it was faint, indistinct. Then it grew louder. Cheol froze. It was Minho's voice, but he'd never heard it like that before, choked, trembling with terror. No, I didn't mean to. I didn't want to." Cheol stood and slowly approached the storage door. Minho stood in the middle of the room, tears streaming down his face, staring at the dark corner in horror. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "Dad, I'm sorry I didn't save you when you were drowning." That evening, he and his father had been coming back from fishing. His father was drunk, kept reaching for the motor, insisting he still knew how to handle it. Minho saw him slip, fall into the water. And that was it. He didn't save him because he froze. That stupid human paralysis. He just stood there, thinking, he'll surface any second. He'll climb back in himself. His brain refused to accept it was real. And then it was too late. In the corner stood the shadow of Minho's father, whispering the same old terror his son had buried for years. The one he had never spoken of to anyone. And Cheol, with his own soul turned inside out, had become the channel that called up other people's demons. At that moment, the bar door burst open and Yun-hee rushed in, followed by her husband, Kang Seok Cheol. "I knew you were here," she shouted. "What did you tell him, Cheol? What nonsense are you spreading? I never cheated on my husband with you." Cheol stayed silent, head down, eyes averted. Kang stepped forward. "So it's true, huh?" he yelled. He looked at his wife, then back at Cheol. "Why don't you say something, Cheol? Nothing to say? So you admit my wife was sleeping with you?" "He's lying," Yun-hee screamed, her voice cracking. "I never cheated on you. We were just friends." She broke down, crying, covering her face, and for a second the bar went silent. Only Cheol saw So-yeon appear behind her, rising from the fog, looking at him with that same weary, knowing gaze. Then Minho stumbled out of the storage room. His shirt was stained, his hair disheveled. He looked at Yun-hee and her husband, madness flickering in his eyes. "He drowned," Minho rasped, pointing at nothing. "He drowned, and I didn't do anything. And you're talking about cheating, about lies. What does it matter? We're all drowning, all of us." He burst into wild laughter, and that laughter rang like a funeral bell over the last traces of sanity in the room. Cheol looked at the three of them, the deranged Minho, hysterical Yun-hee, furious Kang, and at the two shadows standing behind them, Minho's father and Cheol's dead wife, So-yeon. The truth, like a poisonous gas, filled the room, choking everyone inside and exposing their own hidden, uglier sins. He had wanted confession to bring him peace. Instead, it made everything worse. He hadn't found forgiveness. He'd triggered a chain reaction of reckoning. Suddenly, Kang Seok Cheol, unable to bear the sight any longer, lunged forward. "Enough!" he roared, his fist slamming into Cheol's face. The punch was heavy and precise. Cheol slowly got back on his feet. Blood ran from his nose, but he didn't wipe it. He straightened up and looked at Yun-hee. "We were lovers. You knew I was married. You saw my pain, my doubts, and you didn't care. You liked the game. We were both vile. Both." He turned to Kang. "And you knew too. Not everything, but enough. You just chose not to see it, because the truth would have been inconvenient. You're a coward, just like me. We're all cowards here." He looked around the room, at the living and the dead. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I am my lie. I am my betrayal. And you're all your secrets, your lies, your silence." He didn't wait for an answer. He simply turned and walked toward the door. No one tried to stop him. Not the living, not the dead. They just watched him go, and their eyes no longer held hatred, only emptiness, born from total and final recognition. Recognition that they were all just pale shadows of the people they once wished to be, and that their only truth was their sin. Cheol stepped out of the bar, the door clicking softly shut behind him, cutting him off from that world of screams, tears, and silent reproach. He didn't notice when he reached the outskirts, near the old, abandoned train station where a single train arrived once a day. He sat on the cold stone steps and took a lighter from his pocket, flicking it. The small flame trembled in the wind, and in its light he saw them. They stood at a distance, not coming closer. So-yeon in front, and behind her the others, pale, translucent figures, the shadows of the whole town. They looked at him not with reproach anymore, but with silent understanding. The train pulled into the station, and Cheol understood. After the truth, there is no going home. He took a step into the fog, and disappeared, the way names disappear once everything has been said. Hope you enjoyed this story. Subscribe so you don't miss the next ones. And remember, the only ones who never fear are those without imagination.